I bring you a tale that speaks about what many of us fear. When the seemingly alive and every day starts to transform into something much darker. This is not just a simple legend from any town in Mexico, but a story where beauty and curse intertwine in ways no one could foresee. I invite you to join us in this chilling horror tale, where what flutters in the darkness may be much more than mere butterflies. The ones of butterflies. I'm not sure how to begin to tell this story. When I was young, that house seemed like the most beautiful place in the world to me. It was in a small village in Jalisco, surrounded by mountains and nature. It had a garden full of fruit trees and flowers that my mother cared for diligently. As evening approached, the sunlight streamed through the windows, creating a warm, almost magical atmosphere. At that time, I didn't know that beneath that tranquility and beauty hid something much darker. Something, as my family visioned the house. It had been a gift from my grandparents. They had owned it for years, but when they moved to the city, they offered it to my parents. Being young and with limited resources, my parents did not hesitate to accept it. The house needed some fixes, but it represented a dream come true for them. A place of their own to raise their children. In the early years, my older brother and I were happy. We ran through the halls, played in the garden, while our parents worked hard to keep the house in good condition. My father, a skilled carpenter, repaired the roof, doors, and built new furniture. My mother took care of keeping the garden blooming and full of life. Everything seemed perfect. But the butterflies were always there. At first, they didn't seem out of place. White and black butterflies fluttering in the garden, landing on the flowers and trees. My mother loved them, saying they brought good fortune. Fortunately, it was a symbol of good luck, and for a while, it seemed like my father was right. He got several well-paid jobs, and even managed to a small shop of bars in the town. Everything was going smoothly, until the gangs began to multiply. It was strange. One day, you would come across one or two butterflies in the garden, and the next day there seemed to be hundreds. They would land on the walls, on the windows, even inside the house. My mother noticed it first and said it was unusual. She had never seen anything like it. She tried to scare them away, but the butterflies wouldn't leave. Over time, something changed in them. They were no longer the bright butterflies that used to flutter happily in the garden. Now, they were dark, almost black with red spots on their wings. They moved strangely, almost as if they were floating rapidly in the air, and their small, shiny eyes seemed to be watching us. My brother and I, being young, saw them as a game. At first, we tried to catch them, but they would never let themselves be caught. Mother, however, began to appear restless one particular night while watering the plants in the garden. Suddenly, she dropped the hose and ran inside, frightened, saying that the butterflies had surrounded her and wouldn't let her move. My father, always so rational, tried to calm her down, telling her that they were just insects, and we shouldn't worry. But I could see the true terror in her eyes. Something was not right. Over the months, butterflies started to appear inside the house more frequently. They would sneak in through the windows, under the doors. Sometimes, on waking up, we would find one or two perched on the bed or on the furniture, always silently staring at us. My mother began to have nightmares, saying that the butterflies were flying over her while she was sleeping, and that in her dreams, the house was filled with a tense and impenetrable darkness. She didn't take long to seek help. At first, she turned to the local healers. It was a small village. People used to trust them in traditional remedies. The initial visitor to the house was an elderly and slim man who went through all the rooms with a concerned look. He mentioned feeling a strange energy, as if the house was filled with something not from this world. He performed a series of cleansings with herbs and lots of smoke, assuring us that everything would be fine. However, it wasn't so. The butterflies returned the next day, darker and more numerous than before. Now, they not only fluttered around but also stayed still on the walls and ceiling, as if they were observing us. The atmosphere in the house became heavy and oppressive, with fear settling in all of us. Even though none of us openly admitted it, my father continued working, but spent less time at home each day. Meanwhile, my mother tried to keep up appearances, but it was evident that something had changed in her. One night, something happened that I will never forget. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Initially, I was afraid, but then I remembered to take a deep breath. I know it was my sibling walking around the house, but the footsteps sounded heavier and slower. I got up and went out into the hallway, trying not to make any noise. That's when I saw my mother standing in the room, completely still, gazing at the wall where dozens of dark butterflies had gathered. The butterflies formed a peculiar pattern, like a swirl of black and shiny wings. My mom was whispering something, words I couldn't make out. I approached, but just as I was about to call out to her, butterflies dispersed and flew off in all directions around the house. My mother fell to her knees on the floor, crying. As I rushed to her side, "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling. But she couldn't speak to me. My dad came running a moment later, his expression changing when he saw my mother on the floor and the butterflies all over the house. That was the first time I saw him truly scared. He didn't say a word, but that same week, he brought in another healer, a man who, as I what she had been told, had dealt with curses before. This healer was not as kind. He walked through the house, silently muttering to himself, and in the end, my mother said something I will never forget. "This house is marked. The butterflies are not what they see. Someone or something has brought this darkness here, and what is happening will not stop easily." My mother tried to explain, telling him that the butterflies had always been there, that she had never seen anything bad in them before. But the healer shook his head. "The butterflies are just a sign," he said. "Something bigger is behind all of this, something that wants to consume this house, and also those who live within it." After the healer's warning, things in the house got much worse. My mother who had always been strong, began to deteriorate rapidly. It was as if a shadow had taken hold of her. She barely spoke, and when she did, her words were gentle, barely a whisper. I saw her many times, seated in the living room, gazing out the window with a distant look on my face. Dark butterflies landed on the glass, and mobile, as my father watched me, trying to stay composed. I could sense the fear he was trying to conceal in his eyes. He knew he couldn't fix this with his hands like he usually did with house repairs. His everyday tools wouldn't protect us from whatever had taken residence in the house. I recall one particular afternoon when the healer returned for one last attempt to cleanse the house. My parents were unwilling to give up so easily, despite knowing the danger surpassed understanding. They clung to hope that there was something they could do to stop whatever was causing them harm. The healer arrived with a bag full of herbs and some amulets. This time, his expression was more serious than before. He didn't try to reassure us with soft words or false hopes. He asked my brother Yami to join us in the garden while he explored the residence with my folks. We could hear the whisper of the prayers and the tinkling of the charms hanging there. Hours went by, and my brother and I, even though we were young, could no longer disregard what was unfolding. We sensed the tension in the atmosphere, and the chill emanating from the house. Every time we glanced at the windows, we saw the dark butterflies gathering on the panes, a sign that something was about to transpire. Suddenly, everything came to a halt. The whisper of the candle stopped. The air seemed to grow even heavier and tenser. My mother rushed out of the house, screaming, her face covered in tears and her body trembling. My father followed, attempting to console her, but he couldn't hide the fear. He also felt. We ran towards them, worried, but my father halted us with a glance. "Don't come in," he yelled, and that was enough to freeze us in our tracks. What unfolded next is something that even to this day we remember vividly. Oh, I am about to narrate how the healer exited slowly from the dwelling, but he was no longer the same man who had entered. His eyes were empty, as if whatever was inside the house had taken something from him. He trembled as he spoke, his hands gripping the talisman so tightly that they seemed on the verge of breaking. "I can't do more," he said with a shaky voice. "This goes beyond what I can handle. The house is cursed. Whatever dwells here is not of this world. You must leave immediately." My mother collapsed to the floor, crying silently. My father remained silent, clenching his fists in frustration. There was no more hope, nothing left to do that night. My parents had a private conversation behind closed doors. My brother John and I were not present, but I could overhear some words seeping through the walls. They spoke about leaving, abandoning the house they had worked hard to uphold. My mother was adamant that they couldn't keep living there, that if I didn't do it in the darkness, they could consume them. At first, my father was resisting, saying they couldn't leave and had nowhere else to go. But eventually, he accepted the unavoidable. Shortly after that conversation, preparations began to leave the house. My father sold what he could, but most of our belongings remained there. There was no time or energy to take everything. It was as if the house itself was pushing us to leave as soon as possible. The days before we left were strange. The butterflies seemed to be more present than ever, fluttering around every corner and every room. The house that had once been our sanctuary now felt like a trap. Every time we tried to sleep, we felt its presence. Even in the darkness, we could hear the gentle fluttering of wings. I remember one particular night, the last one we spent in the house. We were all in the living room. All my parents and my sibling were in complete silence. No one dared to speak. But we all knew something was wrong. The atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. And the butterflies that usually stayed on the windows had somehow come in. They were everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, perched on the furniture, moving slowly, as if they were part of the house itself. My mother, who had always been the most affected by everything that had happened, suddenly stood up and began to pray softly. My father tried to stop her, but she gently pushed him away. She approached the butterflies on the walls, her hand trembling as it reached out to them. "Leave us alone,"